Okay, so sorry, as I just kind of said, what we're doing now is I have the actual web API from week 1 up and running, and we're going to go through and create an actual client, but this time not a console, but something with a graphical user interface as well, right? So I have a copy paste file that I have open here, right? I've downloaded it already to save some time. So I'm going to start a new UWP project. I'm going to call it something in particular. Hang on. Okay, so just, pardon me, I got to back up a little bit here for the recording. So we just have the web API up and running, so I can come here, I can test it and so on. We've seen already how we can do all our CRUD operations right through this Swagger interface, but I'm just going to leave that minimized. I've started a new copy of Visual Studio that I'm going to use to create my blank application. But be careful when you choose. We aren't quite ready to go to the WinUI 3 yet, right? So we're going to stick with Universal Windows application for now. So blank app, Universal Windows, right, with C#. So I'll just click Next. And I'm going to name it Medical Office WebAPI Client. This is about the only time that you'll see me not have underscores in the name of my project, right? Because this actually this gets installed as an app on my computer. And I don't want ugly looking underscores showing up in the name of the application itself. So don't worry, in the background, in the code, it will put it, when it creates the namespace, it will use underscores there instead of spaces. But here is a case where I'll actually just use spaces between the names. Location, that's fine, I'll leave it there. And the name, solution name is fine exactly the way it is, so I'll just click Create. And I can take these default values. They're perfectly fine for what I want to do. Okay, now we wait. Snooze a little, go for coffee, come back. Shouldn't take too long, actually. All right. There we go. So I know I'm not going to take time walking through the basics of UWP because you've been using it already quite a bit, right? We know we have a main page already. We have the app object where it's a singleton and we can put things there, resources we want to use throughout. We'll get more into that later on. But for now, the main thing I want to do is I want to add the plumbing for being a client for my web API. Now, what do I need, okay? Well, just to keep it organized, remember, we don't have a database in the client. The database is in the cloud, so to speak, in the web API. But I'm still going to have an object-oriented approach, right? We did touch on this in our discussions earlier that we have the database, we have our models, and we use LINQ to get the data, and we send all the data down from the server down to our client in JSON format. And we talked about refining how the JSON is put together, things we could do to like ignore certain properties that we don't want serialized because, heck, we can just rebuild them. Summary properties, for example, on the client. But we want to continue with a object-oriented approach on the client, so once more, I will add a models folder, just to keep it organized. So I'm going to add that folder, models, and while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to add a folder for data as well. Now, my data folder, in this case, will not contain a database, but it's going to contain my repository classes. Repository is yet another design pattern. The idea is that we define an interface for a repository, and then we can implement that interface with any kind of technology we want, right? So if we're going to switch from using a web API, maybe we will, in some circumstances, directly connect to SQL Server or Oracle or some other MongoDB. Doesn't matter what's behind the curtain. We just have a standard interface for our repository that says, hey, if I want to go get patients, just call this command. How it gets implemented, that's in behind, right? So that's what we're going to use the data folder for. A little bit different purpose, but the same general concept. That's where we get our data from. Okay, it's just not a database this time. Okay, now we will need that same NuGet package we use with our simple console. We still need to have our web API client, right? So I'll do that now. I'll come down to my NuGet package manager. I could do it interactively, but I have the command right here in my copy paste file. So I'm just going to install package. Up a little bit. Microsoft ASP.NET Web API Client, exactly the same one we used in our console app the other day. There we go. That'll give me the ability to have it automatically go through and take collections of objects as they're described in my JSON, and then actually materialize them as objects in my code itself. All right, so in my models folder then, I might as well add my doctor and patient. Add class for doctor. By the way, whether you leave it as internal or public, at this point makes no real difference. I have it as public in most of my copy-paste files, but I can leave it as internal and it works just fine. I'm just so I don't have to worry about changing it, I'll probably make it public. Okay, so for my patient class, now you'll notice some differences. I'll talk about them before we go on, but let me just get the rest of the code in place. In our demo the other day, I showed you how I can actually take the JSON. Oh, I've got that. That's in my copy-paste file. Sorry. You can take the data coming from your JSON from the Web API and use this little trick, right? Remember, paste special, JSON or XML as classes, and it will generate classes for you, right? With properties and data types and everything, okay? That's in the recording, so if you didn't catch it, watch that one, right? Now, they aren't perfect when you do that, though. It does its best guess. It looks at the data that's there and figure out what kind of a data type it thinks it should use. So, for example, the row version, it'll just be a string, right? Because, oh, just looks like a string, so it assumes it would be a string. But, you know, we have the advantage that we built the back end, so I know that a byte array is the best way to represent it here, right? Okay. All right, so again, I have my summary properties here for the basically the full name and the formal name, okay? I have in the patient, I've done something a little different. I've made a new summary property that doesn't exist on the server. I called it age doctor, right? Because it shows age colon, and then the actual age of the patient, and then the full name of the doctor, all as one summary property. I did that in this model because when I build my little UI, which is going to run on a mobile device like this perhaps, it's nice and simple to have that all put together for me. My point is, the summary properties here don't have to be the same as the summary properties I might use in the actual web, right, in the Web API itself. The only reason for actually having those summary properties in the Web API and the model classes there is I might eventually reuse them with an MVC controller, right? And that way I have them available in a MVC view as well. Okay, all right, so we have a lot of flexibility in how we put these classes together. You notice the lack of what? Data annotations. They don't serve any real purpose in this kind of an application, so I don't need them here. They're great up on the server side, don't really have a use for them down here on the client. Okay, now one thing I'm going to add as well is another folder for utilities. Like that name, you could name it something else. Helpers is another common name that some tutorials you'll find online use, but to me they're a bunch of utilities. So I'm going to add in here a little helper class. There's more than one right way to do this kind of programming. I'm going to add a class here I'm going to call Jeeves. How many people are familiar with the TV show Jeeves and Wooster? Ever seen it? Okay, I'm sorry, I've got to take time to show you a little bit of Jeeves and Wooster. You'll recognize the main actor for sure, or the two main actors, I should say. Oh, go away. Okay, I don't. Very young Hugh Laurie, Dr. House, MD, and along with him is, oh, come on, there we go, Stephen Fry, right? It's a hilarious, silly British comedy. where he's the butler, Jeeves, and House, or Steve Laurie, is the gentleman that he works for, although he's not very rich, but he is a, quote, a gentleman. Anyway, it's a great show. So I had to think of a name for a helper, so I thought Jeeves. Jeeves is a great butler. He's going to help us out here with our application, okay? I'm going to make it a static class. Again, it could be internal or public. It doesn't matter. For our purposes anyway. So I'm going to throw a couple of methods in here, as well as this seemed like a nice simple place for me to put the path to the URI where I'm going to actually get my data. Got to store it somewhere. I want it in one spot. So to keep things simple, I'm going to throw it in here for now. Now, I'm not using HTTPS, so I'll change that. And remember, we said I have to remember that port number? 5233, right? So I'm going to change that here. That's the port, 5233. So that's my base URI, right? And then all the other commands I'll use to talk to the web API will be added onto this, right? So I'll store that right here. The other thing I have in Jeeves is a couple of methods I'll call from anywhere. Show message and a confirm, right, dialog box. You've used message box before with UWP, right? This is just a variation. A confirm dialog, or content dialog, I should say, is similar in functionality, but more powerful. The difference is the content dialog is well, you probably know this from working with the XAML and UWP. Some objects are content objects, where you can put they can contain one content object, but that can be anything, right? Anything in XAML that is supportable can be the content of a content dialog. So it makes it much more powerful or flexible than a simple message box, because I'll probably do a demo of this later on in the term, but you can put in there, have a video running as the background of the dialog box if you want to, because it can contain anything, and that can contain, you can have grids of data and so on and so forth, all inside your, quote, message box, right? So it's a very, very powerful tool to use as you're adding something but it works like a simple message box as well. That's all I'm doing here. I'll have a title, have a message, an OK button, and that's it, right? Or the confirm one, it just has a yes, no button. So I can say, do you want to delete a record? Yes, no type of thing, right? So I'm just doing it with a slightly different approach than maybe what you've used in the past with the content dialog. So those are all little features I've given to Jeeves, look after for me, and then anytime I want them, I just say, hey, Jeeves, give me show a message for me, or whatever, right? Okay, so I have that in place. Now, let's get back to that data folder, right? Here's the one that I said is going to be a little bit different usage than data that we've done in the past. What we're going to do is, following this repository design pattern, I'll define my interfaces first. So I'm going to add, I'll select class here. It'll technically be an interface, but I'm going to call it, do you remember the naming convention for interfaces? You've used them before, I know. Yeah. not very difficult, that question, was it? Right? So I'll call it my doctor repository. We'll add that interface. And then I'm going to give count them two tasks that are defined in this interface. Remember, at this point, I'm leaving it just as still a read only. We're not going to worry about the rest of the CRUD operations. We're just going to get the data. So I want to be able to go and get all the doctors, or get one doctor by ID, right? Now, to implement this interface, I'm going to add a class this time, and it will be my actual doctor repository. Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to make them public otherwise I'll mess up as I go back and forth between my code. Okay. So this will implement doctor repository, right? Now I could let it generate scaffold code for me if I selected to implement the interface, but I'm going to do it myself anyway, so I'll leave that for now. To save time and avoid me messing up here, I will just paste in from my copy-paste file and we'll walk through the code. Okay, so here's the constructor, but see, I'm going to need a private read-only HTTP client object. We use that same one inside of our console version of our client for the Web API. Now it's underlined in red because there's multiple choices, okay, for the using here. There's a couple different ones that have the same name. There's one that lives in System Net HTTP and a older one, Windows Web HTTP. So just be careful, make sure you use the newer system.net HTTP. Okay, now the underlining's gone away because we added the correct using up top. Okay, so as we construct the repository, I'm going to go to Jeeves, the butler, ask for my DB URI, right? And that's going to be my base address for my client. And then this is the same code we essentially used inside of our console app as well, right? We'll clear the request headers. I'm going to set it up to ask for application/JSON. We want JSON formatted data, right? And that's all ready to go now. Okay, my client has the basics in place. So I'm going to implement, remember our interface said we need a task for get doctors and one for get doctor where we pass in the ID. So get doctors here returns a list of doctor objects, right? We'll go to the client, get asynchronously API/doctor. Now, if I'd set it up differently in my Web API, if I'd said something else for those 3 letters, or whatever letters I wanted to use, I'd just make sure I match. This is how it's serving it, is API/doctor, so I'll ask it using the same URI, right? Now, this is a little different approach from what we did in our console app. Remember we used that option, ensure success status code, right? So if it's any of the success status codes, yeah, we were just making sure, otherwise it would throw an exception. I'm just going to do it slightly differently with an if instead, okay? If we have a success status code for the response, then I know what I'm going to do. Else, I'm going to throw an exception, okay? Could not access the list of doctors. So it's my own new custom exception that I'm just making up on the fly here, basically, right? Okay, don't worry. We aren't really going to worry about handling exceptions in the repository. That's one thing about the repository design pattern. You don't try to handle the exceptions you get there, right? You just throw exceptions back to the actual client application to deal with them, right? We're just going to throw a new exception here if we don't get a success status code, okay? But if we do, we have success, we got data, yay, right? Or no errors anyway. Then we're going to go to the data, read it, okay, and generate automatically our list of doctor objects. That's why we needed to have a doctor class. We had to have an object, a model class defined to work with, right? So that'll get us our list of doctors, and that's what we return. Bada bing, bada boom, okay? The second task that we defined was get doctor, where we pass in an integer number, the doctor ID. So same thing, we'll just get async, but we'll call the API/doctor, and the Web API is smart enough. Remember how that works? We still have it running here. Okay, that when we come to the patient controller, doctor controller, oh, here it is, right? It's smart enough to say, okay, remember, if we just say a get, we're going to get doctors. If we ask for a get for this controller, but we give it an ID, an integer value, then it knows right away to route it to this method, right? To get the doctor where we filter, find it by the ID, right? Okay, so that's how it looks on the client, okay? We go API/doctor. We don't have to add anything else at this point to the URI. We just pass it an ID, and then it'll recognize that pattern in our request and route it to the correct action in the controller up in the cloud. Again, if we get a success status code, then we'll come in here. Now we're not creating a list, we'll just get one doctor. We'll just read as async, getting the one doctor from the JSON data that gets returned. And that's the doctor object that we return. So we took all that data in JSON format and built our doctor object, right? And because of the properties we added to our local doctor class, it will have certain summary properties and so on added as well. Otherwise, we'll just throw an exception, hey, could not access that doctor, the one you asked for. And that's the basic steps, okay? But of course, we need repositories now for patient as well. So I'll right click, we'll add a class, technically it's an interface for our patient repository. And we aren't going to worry about the rest of CRUD operations, but we have 3 tasks that we can define here. Give me all the patients, get 1 by the primary key of the patient, or get patients by doctor, where we pass the doctor ID, right? And that's what we set up in our web API as well. So when I implement this interface, so I'll add a class for patient repository. Again, the HTTP client, we have to identify which one we want. System.net HTTP is the namespace where this guy lives. Okay, and here's our public. Oh, it didn't give me an error. I wasn't sure, being internal, if it would complain about that. Doesn't seem to, but I'm going to be safe. Okay, so you see it's exactly the same arrangement here. We have get patients by doctor, right? Now this is a little interesting, so I'll point out here. This is where we're getting a filtered list. Multiple patients still, right? So it's a list of patient objects. Okay, we pass in the doctor ID. So it's patient by doctor. That's how we set up the URI, is defined in the web API, and then we pass the doctor ID. Okay, if we have a success status code, then it's straightforward. We just read as async all the data coming down, build our list of patient objects, and return it, okay, as patients. Else, so if we don't have success status code, there's one in particular I thought we could anticipate. If we get a not found code, mean that it was empty. There might be patients there, but there are no patients assigned to this particular doctor, right? So if that particular status code is not found, then I'm pretty confident I know that's the problem. So I'll throw a new exception saying, can't find any patients for that doctor, right? As opposed to just couldn't access the list of patients by doctor, right? If it was a different status code, like maybe a conflict or who knows what, or a bad request or something, right? Then I know that that's not the case. Okay, all right. So then our last one is to get our single patient identified by the ID of the patient. Bada bing, bada boom. And that gives us our repositories that we're going to need. Any questions about those? Again, the idea of having the interfaces is later on, if I want to go get patients just directly connecting to a SQL server or something else, I can just implement a different implementation of the repository, satisfying the same interface, and away I go, right? Okay, well, I'm going to close all those tabs, clean up the screen. Now let's actually build the UI. Yeah, I see with our console we had no UI, but now we get to actually make it look pretty. Well, somewhat anyway. All right, so here's my main page. There we go. How many people like using the design surface for a UWP? Yeah? Okay, my sympathies. I don't know. To me, it just never made a lot of sense. So, you know, dragging and dropping things on here, I find I usually get myself into more trouble than anything else. So this is the way I normally arrange the screen. I click the little vertical up split arrow, right? And then I swap left and right sides here with this button. And you know what that allows me to do? There's one down here that basically says collapse pane. There. Get rid of that silly design surface that'll just get me in trouble. I do like to work in the code. Thank you very much. Okay. Now we have that in place. So we'll come back to the XAML in a minute, but we know there's the code behind for it as well. We're not getting into MVVM yet. We'll do that later in the term. We're going to keep it simple, using the code behind page with methods in there that change the data that's shown on the actual page itself. You okay with that for now? You've done both styles, right? You did a lot of work with Peter with MVVM last term, right? We will get to MVVM as well, but we're going to try to keep concepts a bite at a time as we move along here. Okay, so in the code behind then, well, I'm going to want my interfaces defined here for my repositories. Okay, so an eye doctor repository, an eye patient repository, right? Okay, and then what I'm going to do is in the main page, as we build it here, I'm going to instantiate those, just making up new repositories at the same time. And then I'll make a method. I'm just going to make it right here so that as we load the page, construct it, I'm going to call my show patients. Now, of course, we just have to add some usings. Oh, come on. Usually it helps me out here. Oh, that's why. Silly me. Got to be inside the page. That's what you get for trying to watch as I'm recording the video and looking at 3 different places in the screen. Okay, there we go. Inside the page, I have my interfaces defined, and I'm going to actually implement them here as actual repositories, and away we go. Now, to show patients, well, I might as well make the method, right? So a private async void, well, I might as well get all this code. There's only 2 things, just show patients and one more. And I have an extra curly brace I didn't mean to copy, so I'm going to have one too many. There we go, take one out. Okay. Now that's going to complain until I actually add that element to the UI, okay? But that's okay. So when I call show payment, I'm just going to have a little ring spinning, right, to show that there's something happening, a progress ring. So I'll make it active and visible, okay? And then we'll try, okay? I'll prepare a new empty list of patients, and then I'll go to my patient repository and call get patients. And that's where I'll assign the patient's collection from my repository. And I'll set it as the item source of a patient list, like an element on the actual page itself, okay? My exception here, okay, if there's a problem, it gets a error message about connection with the server, then I'll ask Jeeves to show a message, error, no connection with the server. That could simply be that I'm not running the web API locally here, right? That could be the lack of connection to the server. It could be the simple answer for that. Or just a more generic message. If I don't know the reason, I'll just say, hey, could not complete operation. Finally, I'll stop my progress ring because I've got my data and away we go. I'm going to have a refresh button as well, which I'll just use to call show patients. So pretty simple. Okay, I've just got to get some elements on the page now. All right. Now, I do want to, in my XAML, use a namespace for my models as well. So I'll add that first of all. So up here in the top, okay, I'll create an XML namespace, XMLNS. I'm going to call it, well, it makes sense to me, call it models, right? So it'll be equal to a using. And there's the IntelliSense helping me out. It looks around and says, oh, look at, you got all these options. So I'll use my project name dot models. There we go. So I've defined the XML namespace models. Okay. Now you've done a lot of work, so I'm not going to, the page, remember, is one of those content objects. You only have a single content object you can have on the whole page. Grid works, but you know what? In my experience, you can have a nice grid there, and if you have it on a device like this and you go like that, suddenly you can't reach the bottom of the grid anymore, right? So I tend to go with a scroll viewer. That way you're guaranteed, okay, with this landscape or portrait, that you can flick the screen and get to everything, right? So I'm going to change this to a scroll viewer. And then inside the scroll viewer, oh, I'll put my grid. There we go. Okay. Well, that's about all the manual typing I'm going to do. I'm going to copy paste now, otherwise I'll mess it up. Now, you know, one thing you can define is a background. So I'm going to give my background a nice image here. Oh, so in assets, I'm going to need an image called med.jpg. So let me get that. I'm going to add a new item, an existing item, I should say. And I think I have that in my downloads folder. By the way, it's up right in this learning moment, so to speak, up in the in Brightspace. Okay, it's a little graphic I grabbed off the internet at one point. I thought it looked kind of medical, and it's open source. It's free to use. Okay, there's no license required to use this graphic, right? That's going to be my nice little uniform to fill, sort of just stretch and fill the background of the app, no matter how big or small I make it, right? Opacity, 0.1, so it's at 10%, so it's very faded in the background. Okay, you've done this kind of stuff before, right? Okay, good. Now I'm going to define some row definitions here. I'm going to have 3 rows, okay? An auto height, a star, and an auto height, right? Star, we know, expands to fill the entire area. Auto just means it expands to fill whatever content you put in it, right? Okay. So next I'm going to add a stack panel, which will go in grid row 0. And it's just my big title at the top, okay? My title panel, it'll say Medical Office version 1.0, okay, nice big font, and then centered at the top, right? So that, notice the attached property puts it in grid row 0, right? You've used attached properties. This isn't a property of a stack panel. It's saying I'm attaching to the containing grid row 0, its property, right? If you're not sure about attached properties, I have a little thing up there in my review where I do a little whack-a-mole game where I have this little mole show up all over the screen and you whack him and it makes a sound and he jumps to a new spot. Okay, and it was just using the attached property, changing the row and column of a grid, how he shows up. Anyway, all right, I don't think I have the video up for that. Maybe I'll put it up if you want to see it. Okay, now at this point I'm going to copy and paste the rest here so I don't mess up. Okay, so this grid then, okay, is inside. Now notice it goes in grid row 1 of the containing grid, right? So this is the one where I'm going to show all the data, okay? So it'll have 2, auto size and a star size row, okay? And I'm going to use a grid view. Now grid view is different from a grid, right? It's one that has like cells and it goes across the screen until you run out of room, wraps around and it goes to a new row, and shows a copy of the template, okay, the item template for each item in a collection. So it's good for showing data like this, okay? So inside the item template, I define the data template itself, okay? And here, my data type for the data template comes from my models namespace, the patient class. So I'm once again tying into the object-oriented approach that we're using here, okay, that each data template will represent one particular patient, right? So I'll throw in a stack panel here that I have a text block to show that summary, okay, the summary property that I added to the local class of the patient object, right? And then my age doctor, which shows the age of the patient and the name of the doctor. That'll just be in a text block underneath, right? Okay, slightly different font sizes, so the one will be bigger than the other, and that will be repeated as long as I have data that I'm bound to, okay? There's my progress ring, okay? And then I have a relative panel at the bottom, just because it's fun to use relative panels once in a while, right? They're useful for putting things beside each other and so on. Anyway, all right, so the relative panel goes in grid row true, okay? That's the bottom one of the 3 main grid rows, right? And that's where my refresh button is, okay? And it's just way over at the left, okay? Align left with panel, okay? And there we go. Click. I have a click event, and that of course ties into the click event in the code behind of the page itself. Okay, I think I can try it. Let's try it on the local machine. The web API is running still, so it should go and get the data. Let's have a build error, which is quite possible. Oh, there we go. All right. I messed up somewhere, see? That's what happens when I copy paste. Content can be only set once. All right. So I messed up something here. Hang on while I just fix this. Sorry, I'm not sure what it was. I was missing a closing tag probably on something or, anyway, I just copied and pasted it all at once and that way I have it right, okay? So, I should be able to run it now. Yes, I did start the recording. Thank you for reminding me though. And there we are. There's my, I have it, so I'm just showing 4 records right now in the WebAPI. I could change that to have it seed all that random data, then it would fill the screen more, but there we go. So there's my simple little interface. You can see the image in the background, nice and faint, right? But as I make it full screen or shrink it down, everything rearranges so it's nice and responsive. I have my refresh button, okay? Let me try that. I'm just going to, well, actually, it's installed as an app on the computer now, right? I can stop running. I'm going to go back to the other project, the Web API itself. I'll stop this temporarily. Let me come down to Program CS. Here's where I said to seed my random sample data. Make that true. And I'll have to delete the database so that it recreates everything. I'll run this again. So now I'll have more sample data, right? Remember, I still haven't added migrations. I'm still cheating and using the other option there. Okay, so now, just to confirm here, if I click try it out, there we go, lots and lots of patients now. So just minimize this, okay? And, come on, where's my app? There it is, Medical Office WebAPI client. There it is, with all the data now coming from my Web API. So just showing you, okay, it's just getting whatever data is there, right? And of course, emphasizing again that it's installed as an app on the PC once I even ran the project once. So even though I don't have the Visual Studio project running anymore, the app is still fully active on my PC. Okay, well, maybe I'll stop the, oh, no. Yeah, I'll stop and start the recording because that's fairly long.